I am back to take some next steps on this vessel. I'm pretty sure that's what it's going to be because that's the way I see it in my head and that's the way I'm planning it out. And when I first started, I showed you some options I had for couching on there. I like to start with couching. I like to get my big things in first because then I know I can go back in and fill with embroidery. So I've got the couching down and now I want to add some more texture that's a little more random. Then I can fill in the spots with all kinds of knots and stitches and other things. So one of the things I did when I cut off the edges here is I saved my little pieces because that can add some really great texture. And because all I'm going to be doing is tacking things down, I'm just going to use this thread from the sewing machine. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. I've got some fabric. I've got this fabric might work. I've got some other little frilly things, and I've got some lace. And so what I like to do with this, there's a couple different things that I like to do. Let's thread a needle first because it always makes things easier if you're ready to go. Now, if I'd have been super prepped, I would have had my needles all threaded and ready. But you know, I am not normally super prepped. Once in a while it'll happen and then we'll all be surprised, right? I'm going to double thread this. Okay. Oh, evidently I'm not going to use this thread. This is how you can tell. Look at this is a great opportunity for a lesson. How you can tell if your thread is too old to use is if you're just barely doing that and it starts to break, don't use that thread. Let's see. Maybe this. Okay, that feels better. We'll be using this thread. Glad that I found that out before I had started stitching like crazy because it's really frustrating if you have your needle all threaded and you discover that you've got old thread that doesn't want to be used. So what will I do with that thread though? You know I'm not going to just toss it because I love threads. So just picture these are all my broken threads. We already know they're my color. Don't those become a part of an accent on here? Absolutely. Or I can throw it in my big jar of threads and make cordage with it later. All right. Let's find both ends. I just discovered I had a ton of sewing machine thread and I'm not using the sewing machine that often, so I gave some of it away and I still have more than I need, so that's okay. We'll just kind of work our way through the stash. All right, so the needle's threaded. I'm ready to go. And this does not have to be done in any particular way. Now this stuff frays really nicely. What I don't want are those perfect edges. So I'm going to take just some of that. And kind of like, you know, if you make clusters, I'm not going to use that, but I might use my little threads. I can use that. I can take a little bit of my sari, and you don't need very much. Okay, and the nice thing about the sari stuff is if you get a seam ripper, you can get some nice little frayed edges. This is an old seam ripper. It doesn't want to rip very well, but that's okay. I'm just going to take a few of those little pieces off because I really just need a little bit. And let's see how we feel about this. So I'm just gonna kind of make a little loop around it a couple of times. Again, I'm not trying to make it do anything other than kind of stick together. And then I can pick a spot here. Should zoom you in just a little more here. So I could pick a spot to just sort of tuck it in there. I could start going around, and I think that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of use the heavier ones to kind of tone down the patterns that I have here. So I'm just going to come through and all right, so it didn't quite stay the way I'd originally done it, and that's okay too. I'm going to grab another piece of sari. come back up right next to it. Alright, didn't like it like that, but see, I can already imagine if I come in here and cluster some French knots around there. It's going to go through a really ugly stage that needs more before it's done, and that's okay. Alright, I'm going to just kind of want to, I can already picture some knots and some beads right around there. Now, one thing I did that I don't necessarily want to do is I have this sari too close to the other sari, so I'm just going to kind of tuck it back underneath there just a little more. And if you wanted to, while you have thread on your needle, whoops, you could just go ahead and make a French knot then. Doesn't matter that you've got sewing machine thread on there. You can do embroidery. If you can get it through your needle, you can embroider with it. Doesn't have to be a precise French knot, but it's just the beginnings of getting some texture in there. The texture in embroidery or in textile art is like if you were doing collage with paper, or if you were painting, it's just another layer. And when you look at a piece of art that you really, really like, most likely there is something about the layers that's calling to you. It's not usually that you're looking at just, a flat piece of something. I mean, you can look at that and say, well, that's neat. But once you start piling other things on top of it, it becomes a little bit more interesting. There's a story waiting to be told. All right, I'm going to do one more knot here, just to secure things. I'm going to let this one go really loose, so I just have a nice little loose loop. All right, so that's another little bit of texture here. I've got something left here. I'm just going to come up over here just because there's no reason for it. I'm going to take a little bit of this fun fur. And one of the things that makes it a little bit easier to tie down is if you tie a knot in it. Well, that's not even a good knot because it's kind of short. I can't get the other end out. Let's try that again. If you tie a knot in it, in the center or off center is kind of nice, then you've got something to thread through the needle, thread the needle through. Okay, and then it's just a little touch of something. Now I kind of want to see if I can get that other one down there just a little more. So I've got a little bit more of a loop. And you can couch it down too. Now this has got painted fabric. Some of the paint is kind of thick, so I've got this to help me pull it through the other side. You can use a little bit of a rubber glove. All right, and now let's just come over here. And what if this time we took, this is some t-shirt material, and I painted that. And I'm just going to take a narrow, and I want to cut it unevenly. I don't want it to be straight because it's just a little bit more interesting to me. So I cut it unevenly, and I'm just going to sort of twist it. And there's enough there that I can go through it. And I just kind of want to let it dangle. So I'm just going to use up my threads. And again, it's going to look like a hot mess. Nothing really matches, but that's okay because I'm going to unify everything with stitch. Another thing that's fun to do with sari ribbon, I'm going to cut it in, well, tear it in half. It's kind of wide. And you can just sort of pinch it. And you just get kind of an interesting little knot. You're just going to see, by the time the stitches get in there, you're just going to see just a little bit of something. Just a little bit. I really like that effect. This over here, I don't like it quite so long, so I'm going to cut some of it off. And you could save that for later. But I'm already looking at it and thinking I might want to do something else. I really like these little guys. But I need to, let's see, what happens if we do it with this? I think this is like a nylon. Okay, yeah, because it doesn't want to rip. So this one, let's leave a little loop there at the end. Not a loop, a little bare spot. I'm just going to do a little running stitch on it and gather it up. And let's see here. So see, I've got just a little knot of fabric there. And don't have that much thread left on there, so before I frustrate myself, I'm going to go ahead and knot that off. Now, when you come along here later with your stitches and you decide you don't like this, because you haven't done a whole lot of stuff to it, you could certainly, just clip it right off, or you could just keep going down and cutting it more. Or when you get in there with your embroidery thread, you could couch it down and then you just suddenly have something that's got a little bit of height a little bit differently. So these are a few different ways you can add some stitches, add some texture. And don't worry if you don't like it as it's down there. So now I can come in here with my little scissors and I can get more raw edges because I like to have those little threads popping up. And when I get in here with the embroidery, again, it's easy enough to just add something additional to it. Some knots, some beads, some bullion knots holding down the sides of it. So I think I'm just going to keep playing. And it doesn't mean that you can't do this later, but I like to kind of have something that I'm starting with and then I can build my stitches up to it. All right, I've got some of those loose threads there. So let's do kind of the same thing. Since we know this is going to break, let's grab an end if we can find it. And we're just gonna get a whole bunch of it. And I'm just going to kind of crumple it up. Ooh, I kind of like it going over that. That's kind of neat. Now you could go ahead and worry about having your threads match, but since I know this is a bottom layer and so much of this is going to get covered up, I'm not going to stress about having threads match. And I'm not concerned about whether all of this is going to get held down, because if it starts to loosen up or come untangled over time as I'm working on this piece, I can just do something else to hold it down, or I can decide to snip it back. It doesn't matter. Just want to make it more interesting. Interesting to look at when it's done, but also interesting for me to be playing with while I'm stitching on it. So I'm going to come over here. I don't want to do the same thing in each place either. I want that variety. So we're going to take a longer piece of this. My knot ended up at the end on that one, so we're just gonna that one could just be hanging down. That's also something that could be done later. So I like that idea of that hanging over stuff. It's going to get in the way while I'm embroidering, so I think I'm going to snip. I like that idea, so I'm going to snip that off and save it. I'm going to do another one of these little guys, but with just a little knot. You should hear my wind chimes going like crazy. We've got quite a windstorm happening out there. I like that sari with the just that little bit of the fun fiber, fun fur, whatever that is, the stuff with all the strands. Okay. And it's a good opportunity now, since I already knew that this stuff wasn't tacked down real well. I can just come along and I can either do something with texture to hold that down, or I can just add a little tacking stitch. But I think we'll just add a little bit of something, something. You know, and if you don't want to fiddle that much, you can just take little bits of sari and just pinch it, just make a little V and stitch that down, because once you tuck some stitching up around it, it's going to look completely different. All right, this one's going to be stubborn, so we're going to take a couple tries at it. Mostly what I wanted to show you is just that you can do anything with your little scraps like that to, you know, to add some texture, and it just adds a little bit more visual interest to your piece, at least in my opinion. Now you could plan this whole thing out, you could make it all matchy-matchy, but I'm really trying to give myself the freedom to not feel like it all has to go according to plan, because as soon as I do something like that, then I start freaking myself out and say, no, 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 you didn't follow the plan there. Or even if I'm trying to follow the plan and the stitches don't work out right, then I feel like I can't change something. I don't ever want to feel that constrained by what I'm working on. So you're only going to see little bits of that, and that's okay. All right, I'm going to come over here, since this one really wants to pop up. And there's just a little bit of this material left, so I'm going to see if I can thread it on there. Doesn't look like much, and that's okay. It doesn't have to. Let's get a few threads in there with it. So doing the loose threads like this now may come back to bite me, because they do get in the way when you're doing the embroidery, but if I don't do it everywhere, I think it'll just add some interest. And okay, that's a nice little loop-de-loop. And do I have enough to come up one more time? Let's just come over here. I'm just going to take just a little piece, and then I'm just going to do a little running stitch. So beads will be able to fill up a lot of the spaces too, but I tend to do beads at the end, because otherwise while you're stitching they really do tend to get tangled and stuff, and that's really frustrating, at least for me. I just want just a little bit of fuzzy. Okay, and this is going to go right through the fuzzy, but I'm hoping that then once it gets down to the fabric, I can tack it down. And so when I'm doing my stitches, what I'll often do is as I'm working along there, if one of them seems to be having some issues staying down, then I'll just come back over and add a few stitches then. Like I said, I'm not going to worry. It's just a little kiss of texture. So I was going to split this up into several videos, and I decided, nope, I'm going to stick it all into one. When I paused the video, I had just decided on how I was going to couch these down, and I had couched them down very loosely, and I just decided I didn't like that. I was a little worried about things, so I smushed them down. Now I'm a little bit sorry, but that's okay. It's done, and I have to roll with it. I've got my little bits of texture on, and then I started adding some feather stitch. And what the feather stitch is going to do is it's going to start to unify all these pieces where stuff is coming up. It's going to give me some more texture. And then around these little pieces and maybe on the corners, now I'm going to just start adding some knots. And this is just all random. I can fill this in with running stitch. I could fill it in with seed stitch. I could do just lots more feather stitch, which I probably will do in a few different colors just to keep layering it. But I thought I would just add a few French knots and colonial knots just to show you what I mean about building up around where I added those texture bits. And the idea about doing something like this that's freeform is that's just it. You just make it up as you go. You don't have to follow any kind of rules. You don't have to worry about, getting to a certain point and then, oh, it's time to, change threads or something. If you run out of thread, you just roll with it. If you have thread left over when you get the end of something, and it doesn't look like a whole lot. I call this the ugly duckling stage. It doesn't look like much. It looks like, a hot mess to some people. And it might still look like a hot mess to some people when it's done, and that's okay. I'm looking for something that I can doodle on. I'm doodle stitching. Just some simple French knots, or I could switch it up and do a colonial knot. Usually knots are easier to do on my lap because I sit there with the pillow underneath me so I can stab the pillow. This desk is kind of high, but you make it work. And I could decide in the middle, it's like, okay, I want to do something else here, so maybe I'll just do these little threads coming through, that's fine. Maybe I'll just add some twigs, or not twigs, fern stitch here. And you can just change it up. And this is the way I built up my last blue vessel, is just doing a lot of random stitches and then going back over it and filling it in with some beads, some more little texture bits. The fern stitch is a nice one if you want to do a lot of curves. It lends itself very well to doing some gentle curves. And you can make long stitches or short stitches or vary them. Because if there's something you don't like, then you can just come in later. With me, if it's an area that I don't like, I come in later and just do a whole bunch of French knots. French knots on top of French knots are wonderful. And so that's what I'm going to do with this piece, is I'm just going to keep filling it in, and suddenly the crazy busy backgrounds that look really odd and like they don't go together, they're all going to blend because the stitches are going to run together. And as the stitches run together, the piece is going to come together, and eventually I'm going to roll it up and make a little vessel. I'll keep you posted on how this one comes together.